One of the things we're doing at the MedTech exhibition today is we're allowing these companies to present their skills and abilities and their technologies, and it's a really nice opportunity for individuals to network together.
This year WEP is specifically relevant to me because the topic is personalized medicine. So being at an event like this where you can interact with people from the outside, get feedback to know that what you're thinking and what your ideas are valid and do have foothold in the real world is extremely beneficial.
I cannot believe the breadth, the depth, the variety of methods of engagement that KAUST is providing for its students, but also the general community. So we've got visitors coming from Jeddah, from all parts of Saudi Arabia, just to come to KAUST to experience WEP. I don't think anything like this exists in the rest of the world, and I think it's an absolute triumph that KAUST has developed.
Okay. Hello, hello, hello. So for those who don't know me, I'm a professor of electrical engineering here at KAUST. I'm the co-chair of this event. And a few months ago, I got obsessed with CRISPR. So I read about CRISPR, I check CRISPR. So how many of you know about what's CRISPR? Okay. So for those who don't know, CRISPR is a gene editing tool that has tremendous potential, but there was a big drama about it last year with the two babies born where they edited their genes. And I kept sending emails to all the professors here at KAUST, what do you know about this, what's happening? So when Naveen talked to me last year about co-sharing this event with her, I said, okay, but we'll have to have someone who knows what's going on, but not from the point of view of technology. We need to know about the ethical parts about it. We need to know what should we be aware of, what's legal, what's not legal, but who defines what's legal, who defines what's not legal. These are policymakers. And so we started to do the most scientific way of figuring this out. And any ideas what's the most scientific way of figuring this out? Google search. So I go in, Google search about this, and whenever I Google the topic, one name kept coming over and over and over, and that's Professor Françoise Baliz. So I said, okay, Marie-Laure, we need to figure out how can we convince her to come to be part of this event, because she's going to be very insightful. She's going to tell us all about what's going on. Now, she is a philosopher. She's very interested in bioethics. She has lots of questions and stimulating ideas about how can we actually think about science and ethical issues that involves biotechnology, about nanotechnology, about health issues in general. She is a university research professor at Dalhousie University. She has lots of awards. One important thing that shows you that the level of knowledge that she has about the topic, she is part of the World Health Organization Advisory Committee, expert on the topic of gene editing. So we need to teach people what is right and what's wrong. We need to stimulate questions. The whole purpose is not to prevent science from advancing, but oftentimes we are suffering from a problem that the people who are making decisions and setting the policy, they have no clue what the scientists are doing. So we need to reach out to them, explain things to them in a nice way or a clear way so that they can actually make the right decisions about how to do the guidelines for people to use. And it's very important for us at KAUST to learn about this. We are on to science and engineering. We are very light into humanities, so we never get our students and our faculty are not really readily exposed to these type of topics. So with that, I think we have the best person on this topic to tell us more about these issues and how we actually handle some ethical questions that we are facing on a daily basis right now. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Françoise Baliz.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for having me here. It wasn't difficult to be convinced to accept the invitation. I was really quite honored to have received that in my email. Now, for something completely different, you have had several days of presentations by eminent scientists, and as you've heard, I'm not a scientist, I'm a philosopher, and I know just enough science to be dangerous. So some of you will know about this film, Gattaca. It made its theatrical debut in 1997, so just over 20 years ago. It's a dystopian film that tells us something about what our future might look like when the world is bifurcated into two groups of people, the valids and the invalids, or the invalids. And just to be clear, all of us would be the invalids. Why? Because we're naturally born. The valids are persons who have been selected because of specific genetic traits that are deemed to be exciting, important, closer to perfection. Now, one of the things that you may not know, however, is at the very same time that this movie comes out, there's a huge campaign advertising in the old-fashioned way, and that was in a newspaper, in print, and this was run as a full-page ad. I have it cut in two to be able to fit it onto a slide. But this appears in major cities like New York, Washington, etc. And what is it doing? It is telling people that they have the opportunity to make certain kinds of choices in terms of their offspring. The focus is on heritable diseases, but then very quickly you see other things like obesity, gender, myopia. And there's an 800 number for you to call. And people called that number not having clued into the fact that it was advertising. So what I want you to think about is that more than 20 years ago, you have this burgeoning interest in the general public with the idea that we could make better choices in terms of reproduction, using the science of the day, which has to do with selection, and now the world has changed. Why? Because we can move from selection to design. And that's a huge difference, a huge, important, ethical difference. So you've already heard the science we're talking about is gene editing technology. The science today is CRISPR. It will be something else in the next 10, 15, or 20 years. There's two key molecules involved. There's a guide RNA, which is the CRISPR, and then you have Cas9, which is referred to as your molecular scissors. And the idea is that you can go in, you can make a double-stranded break, and then you can add DNA, remove DNA, modify DNA. And basically what's happening, our scientists are hijacking the usual repair mechanism once they've gone ahead and made this double-stranded cut. Now, one of the things that's really important is that you can make these kinds of changes in either somatic cells or germ cells. I'm sure all of you know, but I'll remind you, somatic cells are all of your body cells except for your reproductive cells, and your germ cells are in fact your reproductive cells, so we'd be talking about your gametes, your sperm and egg, the precursor cells that make your gametes, and also this work is happening in human embryos. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that most people are comfortable with the idea of somatic cell gene editing. Why? Because most of us would like to think that we would be behind the project of offering therapeutic interventions to patients. So it's not ethically controversial in and of itself as a goal or an objective, but there have been and there continue to be ethical challenges in terms of things like trial design, informed consent, etc. I'm not going to talk today at all about somatic genome editing. My focus is on germline editing. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that when we thought about and originally started using this language, we had something like this in mind, doing work in a lab, either involving gametes or embryos, where what you're trying to do is to make a particular genetic modification. In the early days, and early days now we're talking maybe 2015, so not that long ago, this is the language within which we are talking about some of the ethical issues involved with this science. More recently, and now on my part more carefully, I distinguish between germline editing and heritable genome editing. And there's a reason for that. And that's because there are some scientists doing germline work where they are restricting their work to what happens in the lab. There are other scientists that want to move out of the lab and into clinical trials. And as you'll appreciate, there's going to be some overlap in the ethical issues, but there's going to be a whole host of other ethical issues. And so at least in terms of my own work, I'm now very careful. And when I talk about germline editing, I am talking about making those genetic modifications. When I'm talking about heritable genome editing, we're actually looking at having a meaningful impact on the next generation. And that's what becomes ethically controversial. Now, having said that, I don't want to set aside the fact that there are a number of communities, be they religious communities, be they geographical communities, be they political communities, that also still have a problem from an ethical point of view with germline genome editing, and that's because of the views and values they hold with respect to the human embryo. So there are people who believe that the human embryo has a particular moral status and that we should not be messing about with it. And that would apply not just to this technology, but also to the use of a range of reproductive technologies. I'm making the assumption that that's not where the ethical challenges are today for many people, that those challenges really come to the fore when we move out of the lab and into the human. So now it's 2018, a mere 20 years after that film, and this is Zhang He. This is the Chinese scientist who, in November 2018, announced to the world via a YouTube video, as opposed to an academic publication. And we need to think about that. We need to think about how we do science communication. Announces that he has created genome-edited twins. He has made a modification to the CCR5 gene, and the goal is to ensure that this next generation would have resistance to HIV. November 2018. And then a couple of weeks ago, December 2019, what do we learn? He's going to jail, and he will have a $3 million yuan fine. Why? For the crime of practicing medicine without a license. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that there are a number of commentaries from both scholars in ethics, in law, and the humanities saying, is that really what was at issue? Or is there, in fact, something else? And the law has very limited tools with which to deal with what happened in that context. So what I want you to hold on to, because it's where we're going to end up with this presentation, is what is the role of a scientist in terms of engaging with the ethics of the science that they're involved in? And how should that either constrain or liberate them? What are their obligations in terms of policy making? What are their obligations in terms of public education? And notice that I'm saying they, and I want you to think about what it means for you. So in this context, with this background, I want to again go back in time, and now we're going to go back to 1998. This is a book that was published after a conference where a lot of the scientists were talking about gene therapy. But I want you to see, a Nobel laureate, an American Nobel laureate, says very clearly, yeah, I think an enhancement that would involve making changes so that people would have something like resistance to HIV, that would be a good idea. He not only says it would be a good idea, he actually says it would probably be more important than any kind of therapeutic intervention you might have. Why? Because, in fact, you could achieve all of those therapeutic goals with other kinds of technologies that we already have that would be less expensive, less risky, etc. So, 20 years ago, a Nobel laureate thought this was a great idea. 10 years later, in 2007, the philosophers and the theologians are catching up. And Ron Green writes and tells this hypothetical story, saying, well, what if there was some science whereby you could make sure that a child would be born with resistance to HIV? Would anybody object? And he says no. He obviously couldn't have been more wrong. But the point I'm trying to make is that Zhang He didn't do something that was completely out of the blue. There's a conversation happening. It's happening in conferences, it's happening in academic circles, it's happening in print. And somebody someday was going to be first to do something. And so again, what I want you to think about is the ethics that comes with doing frontier science. One of the things that's really important is that Zhang He said that he thought eventually he would get a Nobel Prize, and he refers to Edwards, who does get a Nobel Prize for the work that he did around in vitro fertilization. So he thinks, I'm at the forefront of novel science. I'm doing this in a context where I understand people will be upset, and I'm willing to take those hits. What are the ethics around frontier science? What are your roles and responsibilities as a scientist? So that was just a long introduction. So now that I've told you this narrative, you're actually going to see the structure for the presentation today. So by way of overview, what I want to do is I want to talk to you about ethics and governance generally, and I'm going to do it in a historical context, and my history only goes back to 2015, which is what makes it manageable. I'm then going to talk to you a little bit about the ethical challenges. I'm going to move through that relatively quickly because I'm going to leave that for the conversation afterwards. I hope I'm going to say enough things that are thought-provoking that you'll have some questions for me. I then really do want to focus on what I'm describing as idealized roles for scientists, and I then want to put that in a broader context and share with you some data about how much the community does or doesn't trust the scientific community. Because if you don't have trust, you ultimately can't have an impact. And so you need to think both broadly and narrowly about what you need to do as a responsible scientist in a contemporary context. So let's move on to the first part of the presentation, looking at ethics and governance in a historical context. The year is 2015. This is another Chinese scientist. And in April of 2015, he publishes a paper that was previously rejected by Nature and by Science, published in Protein and Cell, with a turnaround day of about 2 or 3 days. Wouldn't you all like to have a paper submitted and accepted for publication within 2 to 3 days? In this paper, he tells of his science where, in fact, he's done genome editing with non-viable human embryos. This is critically important. The embryos are non-viable, meaning that for those people who do have ethical reservations about what you can or cannot do to a viable embryo, he's actually sort of done an end run around that ethics debate because he's using non-viable embryos. These are not embryos that could become one of us. He stays within the international norms, which means he does not go beyond 14 days, and he does not transfer this to a woman in an effort to initiate a pregnancy. It's April, it's 2015, and 2 weeks before his paper is published in Protein and Cell, guess what? We have commentaries in Nature and in Science. I wonder why. They've seen the paper, they know what's coming, but they've actually refused to publish the paper. And the commentaries are very interesting because you see the first call for a moratorium on research in this area, and you see a second call for responsibly going forward. 2 different perspectives in 2 different science journals. Now, what's important is that immediately after that, the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Medicine, Royal Society in the United Kingdom get together and plan for the first international summit on genome editing. That is held in December of 2015, and full disclosure, I was a member of the organizing committee for that meeting. So the science happens, gets published in April. In December of that same year, we have the first summit. Now, what's really important from my perspective about this summit is at the end of the 3 days, the organizing committee issues a statement, and specifically with respect to germline editing, this is what's said. Now notice, this is one of those places were I to write this now, again, I would not be using the language of germline. This is an example of where I would be specific and say heritable genome editing. So, with respect to genome editing, we offer up what I think is an exquisite, elegant, simple ethics framework. It's simple. Why? Because it only has 2 elements. And if any of you have ever looked at any ethics framework, you rarely get anything with 2 elements. Why is it complex? Because we actually don't know what either of those 2 elements means. So I want to say that very clearly. First of all, you have to have safety and efficacy. Safety, why? You don't want to hurt people. Efficacy, why? You don't want to sell people a bill of goods. You want to know that it works. So it's non-controversial. You want the science to be safe and effective. But the reality of it is we're talking about research. It's never going to be known to be safe and effective 100%. That's what you're doing the science for in the first place. So what it really means is that that's actually a value statement. Why? Because somebody at some point has to make a decision that it's safe enough, effective enough. And what's that going to mean? And people are going to disagree. So there's work to be done, probably work to be done amongst members of the scientific community to come to some kind of an agreement as when are you good to go in terms of safety and efficacy. The second element is broad societal consensus. And again, who knows what that means? We're 8 billion people on this planet. Do we think we're going to have a vote? Probably not. Is there anything that we think the 8 billion people on this planet agree about? Maybe something like we all need water, we all need food, we all need air. But beyond our survival needs, is there much that we agree upon? So one of the things that's very interesting is that after this statement gets issued, I set to work looking at the second of those two elements, because that's my area of interest, my bailiwick. So what does it mean to talk about broad societal consensus? Well, where I start is something that's grounded in some of the work that I've done, where I've actually asked, what is the role of the ethics consultant in the context of policymaking? And I've come up with two kinds of broad claims. One of them has to do with advocacy. The second has to do with architecture. One of the jobs of the ethics consultant is to create spaces within which certain kinds of difficult conversations can take place. And what I've done is I've used as a metaphor the spaces within which we all live, work, and play. And part of what I've said is that these decisions cannot be made in the lab. And what I'm really saying then is that these decisions don't belong to scientists. I've also said these decisions can't happen in the boardroom. And here you might think of governments or you might think of companies. But it's again saying that there's another particular elite that has a keen interest in this science, and these decisions do not belong to them either. So what do? I say, well, what's a place where we find both those scientists, our politicians, our business people, our investors, et cetera, but everybody else? And that's the kitchen. And the interesting thing is, the conversations that happen in kitchens are very different than conversations that happen elsewhere. And there's a certain different kind of camaraderie that typically happens around food. And there are ways in which we bring our lives, our outside lives, into that space. And so then I ask, what kinds of conversations might we have about this if we thought the right place for those conversations was the kitchen? And then I ask people to actually think about that space. What does a kitchen look like? And very often kitchens have either windows or doors onto the world. And in my fanciful times, I actually think maybe it's not a kitchen, maybe it's a picnic. So what does it mean to think then about broad societal consensus? Well, I've actually done a fair bit of work on this, and actually a lot of my work is grounded in work done by women in the 60s, 70s, 80s, all around peace and nuclear war, and how do we come together and find other ways of going forward. These are women that came to a camp at Seneca to object to the Pershing missiles, et cetera. And in that context, because you have people coming from across the country, it's how are we going to make decisions as a group? And they come up with a number of criteria that I'm going to share with you because I think that they've got something right. And the interesting thing is that this doesn't come from academics. It comes from women activists. The first thing they say is responsibility. If you're going to have a conversation where the goal is to move towards consensus, you have to participate responsibly. And one of the things that means is you don't just get to come, sit, be quiet, leave, and complain. Right? If you're going to participate in a consensus-building project, you have to put something into that project. The other thing they talk about is self-discipline. And one of the things that becomes very important there is what's the context within which you offer your perspective. And it can't just be to put down other people who have ideas with whom you disagree. If you disagree, you ought to have a reason and you ought to be able to articulate it. And it ought not to be what we would call in philosophy an ad hominem, where you're just attacking the person, not engaging with the ideas. And then you also want to think about what could you contribute as an alternative if you're not happy with what's been proposed. Beyond that, it's really important to think about respect. If you want respect, you need to be able to show respect. That means you need to be able to listen, as well as offer comments and contribute. They then talk about cooperation. Imagine what that would look like if we didn't live in the competitive world we find ourselves in. And that competition happens at so many levels, not just within labs, between countries. And we need to think about what is it that we have in common? What is it that we want to work towards together? And then lastly, there's this recognition of struggle. In other words, this isn't going to be easy work. It's important work, but it's going to be hard, and you got to stay in it for the game, for the long haul. So that's the beginning of what I think it means to work towards broad societal consensus. But I need to say something more. One of the things that's really important to appreciate is consensus doesn't mean we all agree. It's not about unanimity, it's about unity. So what's important is not that everybody got to speak, but that we've made sure that all ideas that were out there are on the table to be considered. So I've continued to work with a number of these ideas and concepts, and there's a bunch of articles that I've been writing. And one of the things I've done is I've stayed with these 5 principles that come from these women, and I've added bookends. One bookend is this notion of inclusivity, right? And that's the context of bringing in more people to take part in this conversation, recognizing that everyone will be impacted if we embrace the project of changing our evolutionary story. And at the other end of the spectrum, I make a reference to benevolence. Why? It's ultimately about kindness. Why? Because some people are not going to be happy with whatever this consensus turns out to be. And yet they're still part of the human family. How do we move forward together? Let me move beyond that. It's no longer 2015. Different people have been doing work on these 2 concepts, safety, efficacy, broad societal consensus. And then we have Jiankyu He, who announces, I have created twins that have been genome edited. And he makes this announcement on the eve of the 2nd International Summit on Human Genome Editing. So what's important here is, in this case, it's not the science that triggers the summit. The summit was already happening, but he effectively hijacks the summit and has the attention of the world. Now, one of the things that I want you to appreciate, what's the difference between the science in 2015 and the science in 2018? 2015, I told you, non-viable embryos, stays within the international consensus, which is no longer outside of, kept in a lab beyond 14 days, no transfer to a woman. 2018, we're working in viable embryos, and we are transferring to a woman, and we end up with a pregnancy. And this time, the organizing committee comes up with a different set of conclusions, and I am not a member of the committee for the organizing committee for the 2nd International Summit in Hong Kong, and this is their conclusion. They say it could be acceptable in the future, and what we need is a translational pathway forward. So I really just want you to think and hold on to that. In 2015, work is done in a lab, and we say, oh my gosh, it's irresponsible, you can't do this. 3 years later, babies are born, and we say, well, we could do this in the future, we just need to find a better way of doing it than the way in which it's been done. Now, the interesting thing is what's happened in terms of the science. Nothing major from my point of view. And what's happened in terms of the ethics? Well, the conversation was just starting. So what's that about? I want to share with you very quickly one of the elements that they talk about in terms of this responsible pathway forward is strict independent oversight. What is that? Well, Jiankyu He supposedly submitted his work to what would be the local ethics committee. It was supposed to have been approved. There are now allegations of fraud, which according to the decision in December of 2019 have been proven to be the case. But he at least knew that that's where you go to get ethics approval. I've then given a second example, which is Shukrat Mukhtalipov, who's doing similar work but in the United States, and his research has been approved by his local research ethics committee. But I want to ask the question, how's that independent? Is anybody really reflecting on the conflict of interest? The institution that's approving the work has an interest in that science being successful, being the first or among the first to do this work. So what does it mean to say you're going to have strict independent oversight? Beyond that, there's work done elsewhere. Kathy Nyakin, for example, in the United Kingdom is doing this work. She got her approval from the HFEA, which is the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, which is at a national level. So are we looking at national review? Denis Rebrakov, another scientist in Russia, is thinking of moving in this direction, and he's being held accountable by the Ministry of Health there. China, in response to what has happened there, is looking to introduce new regulations which will require that this research go to the Health Committee of the State Council, which is the highest authority within that country. So is this now going to be the standard for independent review? But I would ask you the same question. Will you not have conflict of interest? Science is competitive. Certain countries want to be first. So what's the context within which we would think about this? Somehow avoiding the problem of conflict of interest? Or can the most we say here be that this would be necessary but not sufficient? If not sufficient, then what else is needed? I'm only going to talk about this one element, just to show you that it's complicated, and I could in fact do the same for every other element. And so I think it's really striking that we've moved within 3 years from a claim that this is irresponsible to a claim that we need a translational pathway forward. In response to this, several people, myself included, penned this article, which was published in Nature in March of 2019, immediately in response to two things: the science of Jiankyu He and the statement by the organizing committee. Half of the authors of this paper were members of the first summit. 2 of the 3 CRISPR pioneers are authors on this paper. And this paper has since been endorsed widely by a number of people, starting with the NIH and Francis Collins, starting with a number of other European societies that work in the area of human genetics. You don't need to read this. This is just me giving you some proof that there's been wide support from the scientific community for the claim that we need a moratorium. Why? A moratorium is not a ban. It's a temporary prohibition. Why? Because we need time to think through the direction of the science. What are the goals and objectives that this science can help us meet? Rather than just racing somewhere, do we know what we're racing toward? I've shown you this wide support from members of the scientific community, the patient community, et cetera, for a moratorium. And I'm going to tell you there isn't one, at least not anything that would be official. And why not? Because a number of very powerful scientists have come out saying we shouldn't have a moratorium. The person I've chosen to highlight here is David Baltimore. And I've chosen to highlight David Baltimore because he is the first author on one of the papers that came out in 2015 in response to the Science by Huang. He is the chair of both the first and the second International Summit on Human Genome Editing. And what does he say? To make rules is probably not a good idea. Well, I'm here to tell you I disagree with this eminent Nobel laureate. What can it possibly mean to say to make rules is not a good idea? It's not a good idea if it's made by an elite group and imposed on the world. But what's wrong with some kind of a commitment to democratic discussion and debate about what's important and why we do or don't want to embrace this science? Shortly thereafter, June of 2019, Denis Rebrakov, a Russian scientist, says, I too am going to do this. I too am going to modify the CCR5 gene. I'm just going to do it better than Jiankyu He. He looked for couples where the male was HIV positive. I'm going to work with couples where the female is HIV positive and there's a risk of vertical transmission. In response to that, the WHO, and you've heard I'm a member of that committee, issued a statement saying to all nations, please, stop this. You need to stop this so that we can do our work. If we're a committee trying to look at issues of ethics and governance, and there are babies popping up all over the world, then there's no point us trying to do that work. And I think importantly, the Russian Federation issued a press release endorsing the WHO's request, which is important because this, although it was triggered by Denis Rebrakov and the claims he was making, was not only addressed to Russia, it was addressed to the world. And Russia is the only country that has answered officially. Let me name for you very briefly some of the ethical challenges. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I do want to focus on the role of scientists. The ethical challenges, when you find them, and you can see this in great detail in my book, Altered Inheritance, largely falls into these 4 categories. People are worried about the prospective parents. People think that there's the risk of serious harm to the children that might be born of this technology. There are concerns about society. Think back to what I said about the film Gattaca and the bifurcation between the haves and the have-nots, the gen-rich and the gen-poor, the valids and the invalids. And there's also concerns about what we might be doing to the gene pool over time, especially if we take this technology and add to it other kinds of technology, for example, gene drive, for example, artificial intelligence, et cetera. And none of this science is going to be used in isolation. But one of the things I focus on, which I think makes my work somewhat different from other people, is also the potential harms to women. Why? Because this technology requires in vitro fertilization. This technology requires pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And these technologies are happening to women, involve their bodies, and we're not talking about that. When we talk about this science, we talk about tissues, as if they're just sitting there in a lab. You go, you collect them off the shelf or out of the freezer. And so one of the things that I'm asking people to think about when we start having this conversation is who broadly is impacted. And I think it's really important to think that these are women in at least 3 different contexts: as egg providers, as gestational women, and possibly as mothers to these children. Beyond that, there aren't just harms to individual people. There are what we would call broadly wrongs. So for example, if I destroy the Mona Lisa, I don't think I've harmed the painting. I haven't even really harmed the artist. But you might still be pretty confident that I've done something wrong. You might say the same thing if I decide that, I'll just go and burn down the old growth forest in my country in Canada. You might not think I've harmed anyone, or you might say I haven't harmed the trees, but I've harmed the animals and the communities that depend on that resource, but you're surely going to say I've done something wrong. Here, there's an attempt to sort of broaden how we think about what the ethical issues and categories are. But now let me move on to the part that I really want to have you think clearly about when you leave here today and when you finish your degree, and basically for the rest of your life. Why? Because I'm asking you to think about what kind of scientist do you want to be. And there's going to be something you think today, and maybe all of you are like I was at one point in time, I want to change the world. I want to make it a better place. And I'm sure that you'll use your talents towards that goal. But the interesting thing is, what will be your pathway? Broadly speaking, and these are caricatures in some sense, which is why I talk about them as idealized roles, and one of the things I want to say up front really clearly is no one person fits neatly into any one of these categories. But there are ways in which I can offer broad descriptions that cover this. So, who is the pure scientist? The pure scientist is someone who sees science as value neutral. It's just pure knowledge. I'm in it for the joy of knowledge. I have questions. I'm seeking answers. However other people do or don't use my science, that's got nothing to do with me. Good things can be used for bad purposes. A hammer is a great thing when you build a house. A hammer is a great thing when you're a judge and it's a gavel. And a hammer is a terrible thing if you use it as a weapon to attack someone. I can't take responsibility for how other people use my science. I just love asking complicated questions. I love understanding my world. And that's what I'll do. I'll put the science out there, and people will use it as they see fit. I've given as an example there Francisco Mojica, who is in fact the person that did the original characterization of the CRISPR locus. And that's what he says. I'm just doing science. You then have the science analyst. The science analyst is very much like the pure scientist in that they generate information, but they also want to assist others with the interpretation of that information. And so they do see themselves as having a role engaging with a broader community. They want to contribute both the information, as I said, and interpretations of that information so that, for example, policymakers are not left high and dry, not understanding how it is that they might be able to use that data and incorporate that into policy choices that come before them. Here I've given as an example Francis Collins and some of the work that he has done in his role as director of NIH. The third category is the issue advocate. The issue advocate also generates information. The issue advocate also assists with its interpretation. But the issue advocate has a particular commitment and understands the science as being useful in pursuit of that particular set of policy options. If we think about something that's front and center for many people today, think about, over the last 20 years, how different scientists have aligned themselves with different perspectives on the environment. Before that, think about how different scientists aligned themselves with different perspectives with respect to the issues of correlation and causation between smoking and certain kinds of health conditions. Basically, what's happening here is the scientist is lending their expertise to a cause that they believe in. I decided to use here as my example Josiah Zahner, who is the biohacker who sells, through his company, the Odin CRISPR do-it-yourself kits. In writing my book, I went to a biohacking event, and I did my little bit of biohacking with E. coli. When I came home, brought it home, people said, "What are you doing? You can't bring this into my house." And then when I went back to the lab with my colleagues at Dalhousie, I said, "Hi, can I bring this in and look at it under your microscope?" And they said, "Are you crazy? You're not bringing that into my lab." One of the things that becomes interesting is here's a scientist who says he's committed to democratizing science, and therefore it's important that everybody, anybody, be able to take this technology and use it. And you then have the science diplomat. The science diplomat does all that the other scientists do, but really what they're trying to do is to help connect up interests, points, perspectives, values, knowledge, data, in order to create a broader conversation. And they're helping people to align scientific information with particular goals and outcomes. And sometimes you can actually only be the science diplomat before you've committed to being the science advocate. So if you want that role, you can't actually take on the role of science advocate at the beginning because you're not going to be able to play that kind of intermediate perspective. I want you to think about those roles, and I want you to think about how you want to do your science and how you'd like the world to see you and read what it is that you're doing, especially if you want to do frontier science. And this brings me to my last point, which is about trust in science. You can only have an impact if people trust you. Because if the starting point is you are not trustworthy, it really doesn't matter what you say or do. Because I already have distance between what you might be genuinely offering as either knowledge or perspective. And so what I'm going to share with you is just a little bit of data that may or may not be applicable here. This is data from Europe. And I want you to see at the very top, which is where you've got the longest bar, that is the trust level for scientists working in universities and academic centers, relative to a number of other people in different kinds of careers. So it's actually looking pretty good there in terms of the story. But now I want to take you to a different slide, which actually looks at a number of different regions. And what I want you to take away from this slide is that even in the best case scenario, only 30% of the population actually thinks scientists are trustworthy. That's deeply problematic. That's deeply problematic that our society doesn't trust our scientists, especially in the context where people are making policy choices, and presumably we want those policy choices based on good evidence. So we need to think about how do we change that? How do we make that look different in the next 10 years? If you're at all interested in any of the things that I've said, I hope you'll take some time to look at the book that I've just published, Altered Inheritance. I've made sure there'll be a copy at the library so you don't have to spend money. You can actually just go read it. My book tries to do something very specific. It is a call to action. It is written for the general public, but I think it's written in a credible way that it should be of interest to the scientific community. It's not only a call to action, it's a commitment to ethics literacy. Why? Because I move in so many circles where all I hear is something that we in philosophy talk about as the knowledge deficit model, where the assumption is that the public doesn't understand, and if only they understood, they would agree with me. And I'm saying that's the wrong starting point. What we all need is ethics literacy, and then some science literacy, yes. So I want to share with you what I think is happening right now. The current conversation is centered around power, wealth, competition, inequality, and exclusion. And that is not the world I want to live in. And I'm hoping it's not the world you want to live in. And part of what I'm saying with CRISPR technology is that if we do this right, we can actually change the way in which you do science. Why? Because my argument in the book is that you don't need to figure out anything specific to CRISPR. What you need to figure out first is what kind of a world do you want to live in? And once you know the answer to that question, then you can figure out how to use CRISPR to help you build that world. But the first and most important question is, what kind of world do you want to live in? So I'm going to share with you the kind of world I want to live in. And I hope you want to live in that world too. It's a world where what you have is social justice and social solidarity. It's a world that values neighborliness and community, cooperation and reciprocity, equality and inclusion. Imagine that world instead of the world of Gattaca. And how do we get there? Here's the beginning of a recipe. We need to first clarify some misconceptions, so we do need to get the knowledge pieces in order. We do need to then really focus on the social consequences of the science and listen to the concerns of others. And I'm going to argue that lastly, we need public empowerment, which has me circle back to my claims about broad societal consensus. I think it's achievable, and I genuinely believe that if we don't achieve it, we will be speeding up towards that which Darwin has already taught us, which is that we are not long for this planet, and not only because of what we're doing to our environment, but because that's what evolution is all about. And if this science is about taking over the evolutionary story, we need to think carefully about what kind of beings we're trying to make. And we do need to think about it in its environmental context, because we're either designing human beings to live on this planet that's going to be a polluted, war-torn planet if we don't do something about it, or we're building human beings to get off of this planet and live in some other environment that's currently uninhabitable. So we actually need to look at this science in its broader social context and think about what kind of world do we want to live in, and how will this science help us build that world. Thank you very much. I hope I said something thought-provoking.
Thank you so much, Françoise. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so we have, the floor is open for questions. I think that this was a very stimulating discussion. We don't hear this type of talk here at CAUS as much, so that's actually a very good and refreshing thing for us. So with that, who wants to be the first?
Great throw. And great talk. That was fantastic. Thanks, Françoise. I'm Deborah Turner. I'm a community member at KAUST. Now, to what extent, you didn't talk much about the private industry, but you mentioned in your last slide that power and wealth are very important in today's society. To what extent are the private sector driving these kinds of like genome hereditary technologies by funding scientists, etc.?
Obviously, there's a huge investment in this area of science, and some of that is in the area of somatic genome editing. And we are, in fact, moving into clinical trials in that context, mostly right now for various cancers. But people do believe that this is going to be different than, for example, the story of Gelsinger many years ago, who was a participant in a clinical trial for gene therapy who died, and we have 25 years of failed gene therapy experiments. So there are a number of companies that are very heavily invested in this. One of the things that's interesting to me is that I've heard some of these investors talk about how, and the language they use is burned, how they have burned hundreds of thousands of dollars on this science already, and I just want to go, could you burn the same amount on the ethics? Like, that would be great. So it's huge, and for those of you who don't know, I did not make it part of this talk, but millions, tens of millions of dollars have already been spent on the patent dispute, and that has been going on now for years and years. It's still not over because what happens in the United States is different than what gets decided in Europe, et cetera. So there's a lot of money being invested, and that's because of what people see as the potential. I didn't go into the details, but people are imagining starting with single gene disorders where you're offering therapies to patients, but certainly in the literature, people are talking about cosmetic goals and objectives, increased athleticism, increased IQ, and if that's your project, this is going to be, big money.
Thank you for your great talk. My question is, I would like to know your comment about some people who have fear that the use of CRISPR could lead to an ideology similar to the eugenics movement.
So I think that that's a very accurate statement, and a number of people have raised that concern and raised it very loudly. I will give you one example to help focus on this issue. I mentioned in my talk Denis Rebrakov, who's a Russian scientist, who has said in June, I'm going to do the exact same thing that Jean-Q Hay did. I'm just going to do it better, and part of it doing it better is not just going to be the science, but also trial design in terms of the patient population. He was unable to identify women who wanted to become pregnant, who were HIV positive, and who wanted to be in his trial. So he couldn't do that trial. So what did he do? He said, oh, I've got some other ideas, and his other ideas were dwarfism, deafness, blindness. And one of the things that's interesting is that if you talk to those communities, they're not necessarily saying, hello, could you do this for me with genome editing? I really don't like being deaf, for example. In fact, the deaf community has said very clearly, what are you trying to do, get rid of us? We have a language. We have a rich community. We don't see this as something that requires your genome editing. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a diversity of perspectives within that community, and we need to listen to that diversity. But there's a very clear example of saying who gets to decide which traits are desirable and which traits are undesirable. And the thing that becomes important to think about here is at the end of the day, it only matters in a competitive world. So let me take something like stature. If everybody's 7 feet tall, it hardly matters. But if there's an advantage to being 7 feet tall and only 1% of the population can afford to achieve being 7 feet tall, then what you've done is you've taken your socioeconomic privilege and you have now entrenched that in your DNA. And that's one of the things that people are deeply worried about. This will not be cheap technology if it ever gets developed, and I do not believe that it will become the new way of making babies for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is going to be the cost. And so one of the things that becomes interesting is who gets access to this, but what goals do they pursue? And the examples we're hearing are all about traits that at this point in time would mean privileged people get to be more privileged yet again, and people that are on the margins will either be further marginalized or they will be disappeared. And I want to say very clearly, for those of you, who want to think about it, eugenics has a pejorative term, is used as a pejorative term because of its history. But in fact, in and of itself, it just means, trying to get better births, and you might do that in a proactive way or in a reactive way. You might stop people from reproducing, or you might make sure that people that have the traits you want are doing the reproduction. In and of itself, you could try to neutralize it and take away the pejorative connotation. But I think the reason people are concerned is because the context in which it will be used really will be targeting discrete communities that are already discriminated against.
Right.
I really liked what you said about how the conversation can't just happen.
Sorry, where are you? I can't see.
Over here. Hi.
Oh, hi.
About how the conversation can't just happen in labs and in boardrooms, that it has to happen in kitchens. But then most of the examples you gave after that were about sort of worldwide conferences and articles penned by Nobel-winning scientists. And so I'm just wondering, like, how does that gap get bridged, that you go from the conversations in every individual kitchen to something that's actually coherent and put in motion on the world stage?
So I think that that is, in fact, one of the biggest challenges right now. So when I said in 2015 we created this term, broad societal consensus, and applied it here, we then had to figure out what it meant. So one of the things I've been interested in is what's happening around environmental science, and there's this thing called worldwide views, where what they try to do is to have conversations happening simultaneously in different places around the world, and after a day that the data from those conversations gets fed back into a central point, and they actually have now links into places like the United Nations. That's not the answer, but I think what we need to start doing is actually thinking about how we can use technology to start to have those conversations in a different kind of way. And I don't think that technology exists yet, because it's not about what we can put out on Twitter or Facebook or other kinds of social media. That's not a conversation. So one of the things I talk about at length in different circles is the difference between public education, public engagement, and public empowerment. Public education is kind of a one-way street. For example, I'll use myself. I give talks all over the place. I still give talks in church basements. I give talks in the public library. I lecture at the university. I'm here at a conference. That's the public education. There's then public engagement, where people do things like citizen juries, and it's an attempt to be sort of a two-way street, and those happen still in formalized contexts. But what I'm aiming for is public empowerment. And I think that we need to get more tools for that. And that's in part what I think the book is about. It's about trying to say, here's a tool. It's one tool, I hope, amongst many. And I'm going to encourage you, why don't you sing a song about it? I mean, that's what we need to do. We need to find creative ways of communicating. So I don't have an answer. I just know that what we're doing now isn't enough. And we actually do genuinely need to put resources into this. We don't know how to have a global conversation, but we better find out. And if it's not because of CRISPR, then at least think about it in terms of the environment. And one of the things I say to people is, think about what we know about epigenetics. It's the environment and it's the gene. So it is, in fact, our environment writ large on this planet, and it is us, the gene, and we need to be thinking about that interaction. And I well understand that if you're in a resource-poor country and you are worried and fighting about how do I put food on the table for my family, you're probably not interested in a debate about the ethics of human genome editing. I get that. But if you're successful and you manage to feed your children, you surely want to know that they're going to grow up and live in a world that's welcoming and that they can flourish in. And so it behooves all of us to find ways to talk about what does that world look like. You going to write a song?
Sure, maybe.
Thank you very much for the interesting and intriguing talk. So I have maybe not directly related, directed to your book or to the talk, but I would like to know your take on the common opinion that says just like medicine is an intervention in human evolution, gene editing or CRISPR technologies is a sort of human-assisted evolution or artificial selection, let's say.
I think you can easily say that. It's absolutely true that there are a number of ways in which we have already had an impact on the gene pool. We do that in terms of who we choose to mate with, right? We do that in terms of those women who choose to already, in a different context, make choices, for example, about gender selection, which then has an impact in terms of society and other kinds of social norms. We have that in the context of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where choices are made about which embryo to transfer or not. So at some level, you can choose to say this is no different than what we're already doing. It's just more sophisticated, and it's a different kind of technology. But I think what I'm trying to say is, look, we can just keep running down this road and never stop to think about where we're running to. And I'm saying now's a good time to really just stop and think, what are the goals and objectives? And the reason I want to say that is I have spent 30 years looking at the ethics of assisted human reproduction. And that's in a context where, as you heard yesterday, we're really looking at personalized medicine for individual women or men or couples who cannot have children, who want to have children, and we use extensive technology to try to assist them with that goal or objective. You also saw on the slides that depending on where you are in the world, infertility is on the rise, and in some places it's as high as 3% of couples. And I'm really aware of that, and at the same time, I think we also know we have an overpopulation problem. And how is it that we keep having these conversations separately? Because they're difficult conversations, as though we don't want to have them. So we deal with the overpopulation problem in this kind of way over here, and we deal with the infertility problem in this kind of way over here, and never the twain shall meet. And we can't keep doing that. We actually have to start having really tough conversations. And part of what that means is there's going to be struggle. Go back to what I was saying about broad societal consensus. We have to be able to say, what are we trying to accomplish? I think we're trying to respond to people with human needs. We're trying to respond to people with suffering. But what happens with this technology is that you're talking about manipulating embryos that don't actually have to come into being. And so there's a different kind of choice being made when you move from somatic genome editing to germline genome editing. And so I don't have any concerns about the amount of resources that we might direct to, very rare conditions. People are suffering. We should respond to that human suffering because it says something about who we are. And that's who I want us to be, responsible, responsive, caring beings. But it's a very different project to say, I'm going to take this embryo and I'm going to make it a different embryo because I want to have beings with these traits. And that's a different kind of project. It's on a different order of scale and importance. And we need to have that conversation.
Okay. With that, I'd like you to join me in thanking Françoise for this very stimulating talk. And please stay around because we're going to be having also a very nice concert here around 8 p.m. So thank you so much, Françoise. And she's going to be around for a few days so you can actually catch her and ask questions.
Great. And thank you.